All right, so here we go. Three, two, one. Hey everyone, what's up? It's Babylonius from WalkInTheWind.com here with our very first live Twitch Q&A, question and answer. I did just finish a podcast, a somewhat lengthy podcast, and I know a lot of people have stuck it out. So hopefully they stuck it out because they have questions, because I do love asking questions. Um, Answering questions, not asking questions. You can't be put on the spot like that, but answering questions. So, um, doing this at the same time between Twitch and this recording. So hopefully, potentially uploading it to YouTube if I figure out, or if people tell me that would be a useful thing for me to do. Um, so yeah, let's get down to it. So the podcast I just talked about, in case there's some references to it, the podcast I just talked about, I started with. Hopefully, you've listened to it already. Um, was we started with a little bit about the artifact power grind and some of the drama that happened on Twitter over the last couple of days in between the holidays. So, oh, I forgot to wish everyone a happy New Year. Crud, I wanted to do that. Yeah, so happy New Year to anyone who's listening, watching, whatever. Um, hopefully, 2016 was a pretty big year in terms of walking the wind and me and the monk community and all that stuff. So hopefully, 2017 will lead for more good stuff. So, all right, we'll get down to the Q&A. So the first question was from Yells. He said he could call me Yells because I will mispronounce his name. But he asked, was the Cinderia change reverted back to 85? And if not, do you know if those recent Sims that I did, I'm assuming he's talking about, were using the 85% or the 90% number? So for people who don't know, Cinderia is the legendary belt. It increases the damage that you deal to the target as long as that target is above, on live, it's above 90% damage. And it was originally changed to 85% damage. And if you listen to a podcast a long time ago, or a couple weeks ago, that I said, I thought that change was bananas. It's a very strong legendary to begin with, so to add basically an extra 50% of it uptime was insane, in my opinion. So as they scaled back other legendaries, lots of other legendaries, they also scaled that back to 90%. So um, the change was reverted back to 90%. And I would be shocked. I don't know 100% for sure, but I would be shocked. I'm 99% sure that the recent Sims that are on Walking the Wind were done using the 90% number. It's definitely, the change has been up long enough that, I mean, the people who work on SimCraft get to stuff pretty quickly. There's a community of people that do it. So uh, how to explain it? I lost my train of thought. So we won't find it again. Nope, it's totally gone. I cannot remember what I was saying. Uh, so yeah, the sorry, I got it now. The sim community, the people who work on that. I don't specifically work on Simulation Craft, the program. I just use it. Um, but it that change has been in there long enough that I would be really really surprised if it's still set at 85%. So I can't say 100% for sure, but I would be really, really surprised if it is. It should be back at 90%. It's just that strong of a legendary in The Sims. The Sims assume a linear decrease in health. So if it's 10% of the health, then it's 10% of the fight, where that may not be quite functionally the same in a real world situation. At least I believe they use a linear health decrease. If you're doing something where everybody blows their cooldowns at the start, then that first 10% is going to be much shorter than the 10% after, once everyone's cooldowns have worn off. So it is simming very strongly, as it had previously. But there's some weirdness. Some bosses, like Helia, that the boss spends a lot of time, or Odin, with a lot of strong ads that spend a lot of time above 90%. It's very useful. So it's a little bit of a gray area, as things are with most Sims. But yes, the change was reverted from 85 back to 90%, and the Sims should be using the 90% number. So thank you for your question. The next question comes from Juco Eighth. He asked, how much do you guys talk with theory crafters from other classes? I've seen that the trinket spreadsheets have been going around a lot of different class discords by now. Yes, I do. We do have a couple. There is a special Discord channel for those of us who write guides, and a lot of the people who are kind of the heads of other communities are a part of that, as well as other places. Some of the people who are administrators in other discords or moderators in other discords or just generally important people are also veterans or moderators in the monk discord. So we do talk quite frequently. I don't talk with all of them. I certainly don't talk with as many as I'd like. I kind of wish there was a little bit more of a community of theory crafters. Um, I have different thoughts on theory crafting, how kind of the best way for it to work. I think the Discord model is a little too open to everyone, but um, I always preferred kind of the forum model, but the forum model is a little bit slow. So everything's got its pros and its cons. But I do talk with a lot of theory crafters. The trinket spreadsheets have been going around because I believe Binkenstein created the first one for mages. He kind of popped in and was like, hey, I did this. You guys can copy it. So stuff like that happens a lot between theory crafters. We kind of ping ideas off of one another or kind of update our guides if somebody else's guide does this and that and stuff like that. So um, there is certainly communication. I'm relatively new to theory crafting, and in a relatively small class, and I haven't been doing it for that long. So there are other people like Callie or Hina, who've been doing it for much longer, so they have much more connections than I do. I'm still relatively new, and I'm not someone that plays all the time or is really on and available all the time. So I'm not quite as involved with other class communities or the people who are in charge of them. But as someone who is somewhat in charge of the monk community, yes, I am in conversation with Binkenstein and Magdalena and um, a bunch of other people sporadically. So that's where the trinket spreadsheet kind of popped up and has kind of spread around. So thank you for that. All right, so Shadley, the next question. And if anyone else has any questions that you're listening through Twitch, feel free just to toss them in. You don't have to, just type them in. I'll get to them. I'm just going chronologically. So Shadley said, any thoughts on Windwalker in Nighthold progression? I do have thoughts. I don't have many thoughts, but I assume your question is going to be what my thoughts are. So, I'll try not to. I won't be that particular about your yes or no question. But I didn't get a chance to do any raid testing. As I've said a bunch of times before, my schedule is pretty packed with Discord, with the website, with my daughter, work, wife, dogs, other video games. I bought The Sims 4 and Civ 6 on all these sales, and I haven't touched them, yet. So, Dishonored is sitting here unplayed and all that stuff. So, I'm relatively busy with my leisure time. Is very busy leisure time. So I didn't get a chance to actually test any of the raids themselves. I did hear that there's a lot of AoE, a lot of cleave and stuff like that, so that makes me happy. I do think Windwalkers have historically been a very strong spec in progression. We've historically not scaled very well, going back to Blackrock Foundry and Hellfire Citadel. And Hellfire Citadel, Windwalker was one, if not the, I believe it was the best melee DPS for progression. I think we just lit it up. Things stayed up a long enough time for Windwalker to set things up, all that stuff. Windwalker really shined. Once you started getting the legendary rings and all that BS, and burst damage became a big deal, then Windwalkers fell behind. Now, Windwalkers are very focused on burst damage with Serenity and stuff like that. Whirling Dragon Punch is a little more about sustain, whereas Serenity is a very bursty, every minute and a half you do a crazy amount of damage. So it's a little bit more bursty. So the emphasis is on that. And, so I think what that does is it puts Windwalkers in an interesting position because it makes us incredibly good at priority target damage. So when a new ad spawns, we can just blow it up. Like I said in my previous podcast, like on Dragons and Nightmare. When a new ad spawns, it just explodes. Sorry, someone mentioned best melee spec in HFC, Arms Warrior, and I didn't raid with an Arms Warrior. At least none that were capable. But but overall, there were arms that, if I remember correctly, was better than Windwalker on a couple things. But overall, Windwalker just was strong in single target. It was strong in AoE. Um, so it did a really nice job in that, had a lot of mobility. And to be honest, in progression, if you can reset the boss by transcendencing out, I mean, that saved us minutes, hours, maybe even of progression. That is a totally understated level of usefulness that no one really talks about in terms of Windwalker utility. Is that we can pour it out and get back in and save a wipe, save a run back. Tyrant Valhari was such a pain because it was the longest run back on the planet, but I could transcendence out, so it was great. Um, and you got to the harder bosses like Tradu just pointed out, so thank you for reminding me. You got to the harder bosses like Manaroth, Archimond, Valhari, uh, where Windwalker Cleave and AoE was insane, and we could just blow everything up with Chi Torpedo, which I hated using and didn't use that much, but other people could. Chi Explosion, like you could just explode everything, and it was great. So on the hardest bosses of HFC, Windwalker really shined, whatever. So that's why I say that I feel that Windwalker was the best melee spec for early progression. Like I said before, people started getting their legendary rings and all that stuff. So I think I was talking about something else, but I don't really remember. We got sidetracked. Um, yeah, so Nighthold, I don't know a lot about the boss fights. Windwalker will do more damage in 715 than it will in live right now. I mean, we got pretty much Serenity got nerfed a little bit, but across the board we got some nice damage buffs. We got some single target focus buffed in the 8% increase. So if there's another PTR patch to move those auras into actual attack power coefficients, then we'll see kind of how that tweaks out. I don't know much about other specs. I don't play other specs. I've always been a one character kind of dude, um, a one class kind of dude. I do try to learn a little bit about other specs. So I don't know how hard or not hard other specs were hit. Windwalker should do better. And since the beginning, I've heard a lot of people saying about how Emerald Nightmare was really just almost designed against Windwalkers, whereas Nighthold is more designed towards a Windwalker's toolkit. So I've put no effort into learning the boss fights yet. We have some very spectacular strategy people in my guild that put all this stuff up that I can just read. So I don't do anywhere near the amount of prep that I used to. So I can't speak. I didn't test any of the bosses, but from what I've heard, the fights favor Windwalker's toolkit pretty well. It'll just remain to be seen how our damage keeps up. So that's kind of my thoughts on Nighthold progression. Let's see. Oh, so good. A somewhat relevant question for that. Juco the Eighth asks, do you think it's likely that we'll see changes to our T19 set bonuses since they're pretty weak compared to some other bonuses for other DPS specs? So that's something that I touched on a little bit on the site the other day because I tested, we ran sims on our set bonuses. For anyone who doesn't know, the set bonuses are the two-piece, reduces the cooldown of Rising Sun Kick from 10 seconds to 8 seconds, the base cooldown, so that's before haste. I know somebody else had asked about that. So, and the four-piece gives you a 1500 mastery for 10 seconds, provided you use 3 different abilities in a row. And that is kind of a ambiguous way of saying things. Basically, as it works functionally is you have 10 seconds to just cast 3 different abilities. You don't have to be in a row. You could go Tiger Palm, Tiger Palm, Tiger Palm, Tiger Palm, but then if you go, and then you could go Blackout Kick, Blackout Kick, Blackout Kick, Blackout Kick, and then if you hit Rising Sun Kick, boom, you get the buff. So it works off the mastery, it works off hit combo, but doesn't quite follow the same rules, so it's a little confusing. But basically, you just need to have hit 3 different abilities anytime in 10 seconds. And I may not be getting it correct, but that was my interpretation. I haven't been able to get on the PTR time-wise, and when I've tried, it just hasn't worked or some baloney like that. So excuse me. Um, lost man. It's a train of thought losing day. And yeah, so it's a relatively. The Sims showed it was 2.5, 3% ish improvement. And on the flip side is frost decays that are getting like 15 to 20%. And a lot of that right now is frost decays are just bananas. They're just over the top ridiculous. Um, my original understanding was that Blizzard wanted the set bonuses to be strong enough that you would take them, but not so strong that they were required. And in that sense, I think the Windwalker one is very good. I think it's strong enough that if you're raiding, you're going to want to have it, but it's not so strong that you're going to want to ignore a 15 item level increase, to switch that part out. So, or at least you'll have to think about it. So I personally think the Windwalker one is, at least based on what Blizzard had said, um, their design choices were, the Windwalker one fits very well. So I think it's likely that the Frosty K1 and some of the other ones that are like bananas will get tuned down. Maybe the Windwalker one will get tuned up. It was already tuned up, from 1K to 1500. So we'll see. Um, I do know that my Sims were passed on through. I don't have any direct connection to Blizzard, but I have connections to people who have connections to Blizzard. So, um, I did make sure that that stuff did get passed on in case it is inconsistent with the strength that they're looking for. So if it doesn't get changed, I didn't. It's not like we got word back from Blizzard that said, "Oh yeah, okay, thanks for the, whatever," because we never get that. But it, they know about it. Stuff like all this other stuff with Storm, Earth, and Fire, and all of these bugs, like they know about it, and I know that's not, for a lot of people, that's not something you want to hear. And I apologize for those watching Twitch because I've just been standing here in Stormheim doing nothing. But I did a lot of my world quests earlier, and I don't want to do anything else. Uh, Even though all of this world quest is just all of it, I don't want to. Um, yeah, so I think the set bonuses are good. They're definitely. When I ran the Sims of all of the gear, hundreds of combinations of gear, the set bonuses were always the top. So um, yeah, so there are concerns like Juko just typed, because they're highly competitive items. If they're weak, then they won't go to us, and that's absolutely the case. In Hellfire Citadel, Windwalker set pieces were like the best. We got one of the best benefits out of it, at least for those of us for the people on the same token. So I was funneled the 4 piece because it was a huge bonus. So there's certainly the concern there, but I just don't know. I don't know enough about other specs to know how things compare. I know the Windwalker one is comparatively weak. So I think it's possible they'll see a change. I think there will be changes. Whether those changes come to Windwalker to decrease the power of other specs, we'll have to kind of wait and see. And that's typically my answer with a lot of this stuff. And some people may get frustrated with that, but um, we kind of just have to wait and see. Blizzard knows about it. We've done what we can. Uh, we just have to hope that they're seeing what we're seeing if it's a problem. But I know there's some concerns in terms of Windwalker scaling with poor set bonuses and stuff like that. So there are a lot of those issues that people keep bringing up, and I 100% agree with. But there's just only so much that we can actually do about it. Um, so that was a very good question. I'm sure that was one that a lot of people were thinking about. So again, if you're on Twitch, if you have any other questions, I'm more than happy to answer them. We've been going for about 20 minutes now, so I will answer. I'll answer a couple more questions. Maybe try and keep it under the 30-minute mark if we can. So the next question, Aganox, I'm assuming it's pronounced correctly. Aganox asked, "How in touch are you with Brewmaster and Mistweaver? Would you consider doing an interview-style podcast or the like about those specs?" And the answer is very. If you're talking about how in touch I am with my inner Brewmaster and Mistweaver, the answer is not very. I have been building up my Brewmaster set. Brewmaster seems kind of easy, but I'm concerned that it seems easy. So I've been very hesitant to actually do it in a raid. But we did have some issues with some tanks recently, so I thought I would pick it up. I used to tank a lot. I was primarily a tank really for most of my WoW playing career, up until I switched over to my monk in Mist. So my inner Brewmaster is there. My inner Mistweaver. I was a healer for a long time. Mistweaver doesn't make any sense to me right now, and I think I've just so past the healers. But if you're asking about how in touch I am with the people who are in charge of that, I'm very in touch. We talk on a daily basis through Discord. Um, the important people, Monkey, Blue, Brewing Scribe, Garg, stuff like that. We talk in Discord pretty much every day. So I'm very in touch with them. I would certainly consider doing a podcast about that. My only hesitancy with that is that Walking the Wind is really only about Windwalker. So a podcast about Brewmaster and Mistweaver doesn't really fit, but it doesn't not fit. So I don't want to say I will. I don't want to say I won't. It's certainly something. I'm sure some of the people who are in charge of those specs would love a sounding board. They can get on their soapbox, especially a couple of them I do know, especially love a soapbox to stand on. So it's definitely something that no one has mentioned before, so I will give it some thought, maybe talk it over with some of those people and see what their thoughts are. I have been wanting to do kind of interview styles podcasts. I've just had all of these things I wanted to talk about. So interviews are hopefully coming in the future. That was kind of what got me started with this was Golvin's Monkcraft podcast. So I would definitely like to do some interviews with some high-level monks, with some people who maybe have changed away from monks and why, stuff like that. I definitely like to do that in the future. It's just hard. My schedule is relatively busy, and I know other people's are, so it takes a lot of effort to do stuff like that. But I will definitely consider it and work towards that. So thank you for the question. That's a very good idea. So if anyone else has any questions, keep asking. There are a couple more posted right now, so I'll try and cover them. So Lavanath asked, do you think scaling will leave Windwalker in the dust compared to other melee classes like Enhancement Arms Warrior? Both value the main stat lower than secondary stat in most cases. In that example, I think no, personally. But I have been wrong on scaling recently, so I don't want to say that that's 100% correct. When people would ask me about scaling months ago, I assumed that Windwalker was going to scale well. Windwalker, the way that Blizzard has scaled stats is that primary stats scale on a higher level, scale more than secondary stats. So on a 10 item level, well, actually, I can tell you. Give me a sec to pull up my spreadsheet, which should be going live soon. We're still working on it. It's kind of far off from SimCraft. I'm not sure why. What was I looking at? Scaling. Oh, yeah. So right now, for example, one weapon item level. You gain, on average, 2.5 mastery and 2.7 crit. That varies a little bit between what item level because it's all exponential. But then you gain 17 agility and 25 stamina. So obviously with item level, and it's consistent with other slots as well. But that primary stats scale higher. So I was under the impression that classes that scale higher with primary stats would scale better. But and I talked about that in a podcast a couple days ago or weeks ago. I don't remember which podcast it was, but I talked about that where I was surprised, and a couple of us were surprised that Windwalker didn't scale so well, and a lot of that is because we don't have any weird interaction. A lot of other classes have things that kind of compound on themselves, and Windwalker really doesn't. Most things are just kind of flat out damage multipliers. Oh, which someone literally just typed in Twitch chat. So we don't have anything spectacular that changes scaling, and that makes things very difficult. The classic example is fire mages with crit. They scale just to an insane level with crit. So I was kind of under the impression that Windwalkers would scale well, and because of stat changes, the stat situations, because of, a lot of people point to the fact that we don't scale off of weapon damage really at all as an issue, and that is definitely an issue, I think. Um, like I said, since I'm relatively new to this theory crafting thing, I'm kind of learning as I go. So scaling is not something that I totally understand that much, and I did actually have to ask a couple people to explain it to me just the other day. But I do think it's possible. I don't know much about other classes. I know Windwalkers now scale even more based off primary stats in comparison to secondary stats. And I don't know how other classes were that. Theoretically, in my mind, if you get more primary stats on an item than secondary stats per item level, then the classes that can make the most use out of that should scale better. But that doesn't seem to quite be the reality. And I am just not a math-minded person enough to really understand all the intricacies for that. So I do think scaling in Nighthold is definitely potentially an issue. I don't want to, since you did ask, will it be left in the dust? I don't want to say left in the dust. Like I mentioned um, in the podcast, this idea of if you're not first, you're last. Windwalkers will be viable. Oh, I should have used that word in the podcast. Windwalkers will be viable. See Windwalkers in all level of content, doing all manner of things to all different levels of performance. Um, you can bring a Windwalker and kill whatever boss. You know, but will a Windwalker be optimal? Maybe not. I mean, not every spec is going to be optimal in every fight. And right now, Windwalker is not optimal on a lot. In Nighthold, that may be different, but that's definitely an issue with scaling. And that Windwalker started out very strongly in Emerald Nightmare and stuff like that, and ended, if you can look at the Warcraft logs statistics, relatively towards the bottom. So that was kind of a bummer with scaling. I don't know enough about scaling to know whether that's been fixed. I haven't seen anything that would indicate that it has, so scaling may very well be an issue. Windwalker may be the spec that Blizzard has to kind of just bump. Um, you know, every once in a while we have to get a damage increase, and that sucks. That's not the way anyone really wants to play. You don't want to be strong one week and then weak the next. So I'm hoping. I know scaling issues have been brought up to Blizzard as best we can, so I'm hoping that there's some kind of resolution to that. I just don't know what that resolution could be. Um, I don't know how enhancement shaman or arms warrior scale, but if they value the main stat lower than secondary, then in my mind, theoretically, they should not be in as good of a place when there's going to be more primary stats than secondary stats. But it's hard. There's definitely it's definitely a problem if we need bumps. If Blizzard has to constantly retune the class. Um, Highmaul was kind of a different thing. Um, you know, Highmaul's a different conversation for a different time. I'm hoping to do kind of a history of Windwalker and talk about that kind of stuff. But yeah, I mean, there are a lot of options and a lot of reasons why I don't fully understand scaling, and there's a lot of options that can change the scaling. So it's a difficult thing to understand. But I haven't seen anything so far that would indicate that the scaling issue has been fixed. So some of these buffs that Windwalker got may be short-lived. It's hard to say. I suggested um, indirectly to Blizzard to help haste scaling with a little bit, adding it to Strike of the Windlord, stuff like that, to make it benefit more. But it's hard to say what effect that would have really on the greater thing. Um, Windwalkers, like trade you just mentioned, a lot of times when we talk about primary versus secondary scaling, it's relative. Um, but if you gain 5% damage per item level and somebody else gains 10% damage per item level, and those are made up numbers, you know, then it doesn't really matter how you compare your secondary to primary stats. I mean, that's just what happens. So that's, I think, something else that was a hang up as to why I didn't really understand scaling in the past, and why I got it wrong. I mean, I advocated that Windwalker was going to scale well, and it scaled poorly. And some of that is legendary power. Some of that is just the style of fights. As everyone gets more geared, things live less long. So Windwalker doesn't have as much time to set up what it needs to do, all the crazy damage that a Windwalker is capable of. So there's a lot of, possibilities to why there's a scaling issue, but I do think that stats are part of an issue, and if Windwalker needs to continually be buffed, then that's going to suck pretty bad, mostly because I'm going to end up having to like redo blog posts and stuff constantly, and that'll just suck for me. So I hope that doesn't happen. But like I said, hopefully I've answered your question, but that I don't know if scaling is going to be that poor, but I haven't seen anything that would indicate otherwise, that scaling has been quote unquote fixed. So that's a bummer. But like I said, I was wrong before. I could be wrong now. There are smarter math people out there who will be able to answer that question better than me. And most of the time, I just have to listen to them and then try and translate it into normal people English for everyone else. So hopefully that answered your question. If there are any other questions on Twitch, feel free to ask them. We've kind of run out of questions, which is fine because we're just past the 30-minute mark for the Q&A. So if there are no other questions, that's fine. I will give them a minute or so to, I guess, thank people again. So thank you for listening. Thank you for popping in. I think this worked out relatively well. There's a whole bunch of people on my stream right now. If so hopefully people who've listened to the podcast and stuck it out for what is amounting to almost an hour and a half, learned something and got out of it what they wanted. As per always, there's links on Walking the Wind, and a great question. I'll get to that in a sec. There's links to Walking the Wind. No, there's links on Walking the Wind to donate, to support me, to support the website, to support me doing more stuff like this. I am very pleased with the interaction we got and a lot of the questions and the amount of people who are watching this on Twitch and stuff. So so that bodes well for me doing more stuff like this. So thank you very much for listening. There was another question that I love to discuss, and that is, what's the best Windwalker transmog? And I